The Wizard and the Vampire, written and read by Cody Goggin. Chapter 2. In a fit of worry, Izyk dashed down the road and across the path that Mason had shown him between their two houses. His legs shook as they carried him as fast as he could run, trying to beat his uncle to Mason's house. The shortcut would only buy him so much time, and he would still need to arrive quickly enough to explain it all to Mason. He leapt across the ditch where a creek would run in the spring. The summer heat normally left it dry, but the previous night's storm had left a small trickle of water running through it. Izyk tried not to look out toward the main road, in fear that he would find himself falling too far behind. He kept his sights fixed forward. At last, he emerged and burst through the front door without saying hello to Mason's parents. "What did you do with it?" he asked as soon as he had entered Mason's room. "The necklace?" asked Mason. "Of course, the necklace. What did you do with it?" repeated Izyk. Mason shrugged and pulled the object from his pants before mindlessly throwing it on the bed. Izyk snatched it up, and Mason jumped to grab it too. Together they held it between their hands with the chain pulled tightly. "What do you want it so bad for all of a sudden?" asked Mason. Said Izyk. "I may have told my uncle about it." Mason tossed his hands up in frustration. "What were you thinking, Izyk?" he said. "I was trying to be honest, so we wouldn't get into trouble. But there must be something weird about it, because he left right away to come over here. I raced to beat him just so I could tell you first." Mason looked back at him with his jaw dropped. "He's headed here now?" he asked. "He's coming to talk to your parents," said Izyk. "My parents?" Mason leapt forward with the object and began to head for his window to leave, but saw Izyk's uncle approaching outside. He turned and looked to Izyk for answers. "What do we do?" asked Mason. "He can't know I'm here," said Izyk. They both grabbed the necklace again and pulled on it before they both dropped it as they heard Uncle Harold coming through the front door. He was greeting Mason's parents. "Leave it," screamed Mason. "We'll come back after we know what's wrong with it. Come on." Mason jumped through his window, and Izyk followed behind him quickly. They both ducked down and crawled around Mason's house and between the house next door. Mason lived on the very outskirts of the village of Bragg. The lower-income families lived here, and the houses were closely built to spare room. Over the years, the narrow alleyways had provided Mason plenty of opportunity to find trouble. "This way," he called back to Izyk. Mason led them to another window where they could overhear the conversation within the house between Izyk's uncle and Mason's parents. Izyk cupped a hand to his ear, and they both leaned in as close as they could. Harold and Mason's parents had just finished exchanging pleasantries, and Harold was beginning to relay the story of the boys bringing home the runaway cow. "So you see, Thomas, I didn't know about it until it was too late, because they didn't tell me right away. But I came over just as soon as I knew that your son still had it. I hope he's okay." Mason's father looked at Izyk's uncle gravely. "Lucy, go fetch Mason from his room. Hurry up." "I'm sorry, Thomas. I knew the storm was dangerous last night. I could feel it in my bones. But I didn't know soon enough what the boys had gotten themselves into," said Harold. "He's gone!" cried Mason's mother from across the house, in a scream that sent both boys outside, ducking in fright. "What?" said Thomas from inside. Mason's father and Uncle Harold both grabbed each other's shoulders as Lucy returned to them. She held up the necklace with the tips of her fingers and let it fall to the floor before their feet. Mason and Izyk continued to watch from the window, enraptured. "Is it one of them?" asked Lucy. "It's impossible to know for sure just by looking at it. I don't even know how to test it. Bragg hasn't seen something like this in over 100 years. said Uncle Harold. "Aye," began Thomas. "I heard tell of one they found in my garden, but it was broken, and they knew right away that it was useless. 3 people still died. Lucy screeched so loudly that Uncle Harold grabbed his ears. They let that fall into the wrong hands. It can't do anything if it isn't engaged with. We just have to find the boys and keep everyone together, said Thomas. We'll have to hold a meeting to decide what to do, said Harold. Agreed. Just then, Izyk felt a hand grab his shoulder, and both he and Mason nearly jumped out of their skins. They grabbed each other's mouths to stay quiet and turned to find Nova Snowdream standing behind them. Her green and purple hair hung in soft curls around her devious grin. What are you punks doing? She said, as if she had never caused any trouble herself. Be quiet, said Mason. The muscles in Nova's face tightened, and Izyk thought he noticed her fist clench. He interjected to try and explain. Come here, he said as he pulled her in closer to the window. See that? Izyk pointed at the necklace, and she nodded. We found it in the woods this morning, and now my uncle and his parents say the whole town has to meet. They say it might be dangerous, but they don't know we're out here. Nova's toothy smile stretched wide, and her eyes glowed. What are you going to do? She asked them. Nothing, said Izyk. Something, said Mason. Sounds like you haven't decided then, said Nova. She motioned for them to lower out of sight and then looked both ways to make sure nobody could see them. Izyk was already unhappy with how much she was clearly enjoying this. I'll get it out of the house if you guys wait for me on the other side of town. The gate. Understand? She said. What? Asked Izyk. You heard me, she said. I'll get it out for you both, and then we can spy on their meeting to see what they say about it. Afterwards, we can decide what to do instead of them. Izyk felt the wind leave his lungs. Out of all the ludicrous things he might have imagined for Nova to suggest, this had to be the worst idea possible. Have you lost your mind? You might have been kicked out of school, but I'm not about to get kicked out of town, said Izyk. How did you hear about that? Asked Nova, and she shot an angry glance at Mason. He shrugged his shoulders. Mrs. Pikey deserved it, she finished. Mason poked them both in the arms and motioned for them to look, just as his parents and Uncle Harold left the room. Nova instantly bounded into action without a word and flipped through the window like a cat. She grabbed the necklace in one fluid movement and hopped on her tiptoes back to where the boys stood. That worked out better than I thought it would, she said. We can just go straight to the meeting now. Izyk and Mason couldn't gather their senses to speak before they saw Thomas and Lucy coming back into the room. Nova pulled them both by their shirt collars out into the road and forced them to run with her through the crowds of villagers. Come on, she said. We'll stop somewhere they can't find us. Izyk felt like he was dreaming a very unpleasant dream. His vision of the village around him blurred and flickered like the light from an autumn campfire. He heard people speaking, but couldn't make out the words, and the entire time he was wishing he had closed the back of the barn the night before. Where are we going? Asked Mason. Nova didn't reply. Her hair mingled with the colors of the town, and she seemed just as confident in her direction as Mason had in the woods. But Izyk was confused and lost. When they finally came to a stop in a small dark alleyway, he was utterly unable to distinguish where they had arrived. What is this place? He asked. Streams of ripped fabric hung from the walls and created ghostly figures swaying in the wind. The hum of the townspeople became low and sounded as if they were inside a cave. I come here to think, said Nova. You think? Asked Mason rudely. Nova ignored the insult. Sometimes, she said. How long do you think it'll be before they gather everyone for the meeting? Mason laughed. Now that the necklace is gone and we are too? A lot faster. Izyk gulped. It was probably true. Uncle Harold wasn't even aware that Izyk wasn't back at the farm yet. It was almost certain he would soon be jumping to bring the town meeting together. "We're doomed," said Izyk. "Nonsense," said Nova. The bluntness of her response made something dawn on Izyk. "What about your parents?" he asked her. "They won't be worried," she replied. Nova ignored Izyk looking at her, and instead looked up toward the ghostly vestiges draped from the buildings. "Whatever," he said. "What were you thinking stealing that and bringing us here?" Mason agreed. He stepped forward and stood shoulder to shoulder with Izyk. "Yeah, what was your plan?" asked Mason. "I told you before. We're going to listen to the town meeting and see what they say this thing is." "Maybe it's valuable," said Nova. "Really?" asked Mason. "That's why you're helping us?" "No," she said flatly. "They said it could be dangerous, and that they hadn't seen one nearby in a long time," said Izyk. "Maybe we're making a mistake." "They wouldn't even touch it," said Mason. Nova raised her hand and held the necklace up and shook it so the chain jingled. She stepped forward toward the boys and made a face. "Ooh, it's so scary," she laughed. "Stop it," said Izyk. She stopped, but she kept laughing as she set it down on a pile of broken bricks. "It looks cheap," she said. "We found it in the mud," said Mason. Nova smiled. "It's probably just some crappy necklace some woman didn't want." She picked it back up and put it around her neck. "See?" she began. "It's useless." Instantly, Nova's body became rigid, and she stood as though she had been struck by lightning. She hissed terribly and fell to the ground. Her head came very near to bouncing off a stone staircase, but luckily, she avoided it by mere inches. "Providence help us! Is she dead?" said Izyk as he pulled his own hands from his eyes. Mason rushed over to Nova and pulled the necklace from her head. "Are you okay?" he asked as she sputtered back to life. "Oh, what happened?" she coughed. "We don't know," said Izyk as he walked over to them both. "But I think it's safe to say that this thing is dangerous." He ripped the bottom of his shirt and wrapped it around the ball and chain. Nova and Mason both watched Izyk closely as he secured it within his pocket. Izyk could feel his legs shaking as the necklace pressed against his thigh. "We should get going. They'll be having the meeting soon," said Mason. "Can you still come?" asked Izyk as he watched Nova struggle to her feet. "Try to stop me," she said. This time they made their way through town much more slowly. Right away they could tell the mood about the village had changed. People were murmuring to each other in hushed voices, and everyone seemed to be going the same direction. Nova urged them to sidetrack down several alleys to reach the meeting hall faster. But she was moving slowest of all. "Are you sure you can make it through this?" asked Izyk. "It's getting better. Just give me some time," she said. Mason stopped them before nearly exiting out into a courtyard full of people. At the center of the clearing was the statue of Kenneth Bragg, who had founded the village generations ago. There beside his sculpted form was Uncle Harold and Mason's parents. "Why are they meeting here?" asked Izyk. "It must be because of how many people are coming. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" asked Mason. "No," said Nova. "I'm older than you too, so I should know." "By 3 months," said Mason with a snarl. "Get over it already. It wasn't only funny as first years in school." "Still, I've never seen anything like this before. The whole town is here," she said. Nova pointed to a ledge at the top of a nearby building and tugged their shirts. "We need to get up higher so that we can see and hear what's going on." She led them to the ledge, and they tried to be inconspicuous as they gathered there for a better view. Uncle Harold had taken center stage to begin speaking to the town. He looked flushed and concerned. Izyk regretted that he couldn't just hop down and announce himself to ease his uncle's worries.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've called everyone together today because just this morning our sons went missing, said Uncle Harold to a gasping crowd.
We believe the boys may have accidentally stumbled upon a vampire talisman, said Mason's father Thomas. The crowd erupted into a frenzy and began whispering into each other's ears. Izyk and Mason turned their heads to avoid making eye contact with anyone in the crowd. Nova stared at the center of the courtyard intently. Everyone, please, said Thomas.
Remain calm, began Harold. We must figure out what to do. We do not want to mishandle this like what has happened in other villages. We need to make a plan.
Where is the talisman? Asked a voice from the crowd. Well, that's the second problem beyond finding our sons, said Thomas with a sigh. We've lost it. How could this happen? Screamed a woman. You've doomed us all, said another. Harold tried to calm everyone down, but the audience seemed to grow in noise and disruption with each passing second. Nova turned to the boys and motioned for them to stand up. We need to get out of here. Now, she said. They dropped back down into the sea of confusion and made their way toward the edge of the courtyard where the nearest people were gathering. Nova then showed them a shortcut away from it all, and they continued out onto a road lined with small merchant stands. A man with his face totally covered suddenly stopped them. The only thing left visible was his reddish beard.
It's dangerous to go alone. Take these, said the man.
He pulled 3 swords from his robes, and they fell to the feet of Mason, Nova, and Izyk. By the time they all looked back up at the man, he was gone. What was that all about? Said Mason. Nova didn't seem to care. She had already reached down and claimed the finest blade for herself. She held it out and examined it with a smile. Izyk hesitated. Who was that man? He asked. Who cares? Said Nova. She picked up the remaining sword from the ground and shoved it into Izyk's fingers. We might need them. She was clearly feeling better now, and she grabbed them both and again ran them through town to a place they didn't recognize. Izyk pulled away from her grip and set his sword back down. Hold on, he said forcefully. What might we need these for? What are we doing? Where do we think we can go? It had all clearly boiled over for him, and he almost felt bad for hollering at his friends, but they seemed to understand. What do you think we should do? Asked Nova.
Izyk froze.
He hadn't really expected them to ask for his opinion that directly. Nova and Mason were both very hard-headed, to the point that it was normally left for Izyk just to follow along with whatever adventure they cooked up. He didn't know what to say. Mason stepped closer to him. Can we see it? He asked. What? Just let me see it for a moment, said Mason. Izyk forced himself to dig the necklace out of his pocket and held it out for Mason to take. It glimmered in the light of midday and seemed even brighter than it had before Nova had worn it. I've never heard that phrase before. Vampire talisman. What do you suppose it means? Asked Mason. Don't you guys ever listen in history class? Asked Nova. The boys gave her a funny look, and she scoffed. Yes, I know, I was kicked out of school, she said. But it must come from the tower in the south, the one where the wars used to start. The Vampire King. Izyk's eyes widened in stark terror. You think this came from him? If it is what they say it is, she replied, but I doubt it. They're supposed to be rare and incredibly dangerous. Well, it looked like it nearly killed you, said Izyk. It didn't, though, and now I feel fine. It must be some other kind of magic, said Nova. Mason shook his head and moved to give the necklace back to Izyk. But another stranger had been watching them from afar and made a lunge to grab it from between their hands. Mason snapped his arm back and tripped the man just in time for them all to scramble and head for the south gates of Bragg. From there they left town on the main road until they found some bushes to hide in. "What are we supposed to do now that we've been driven out of town?" pleaded Izyk. Nova peered at him as if the answer were simple. "We can't go back there. They'll skewer us," she said. "Don't you think that's an overreaction?" said Mason. "No," she retorted. "Besides, don't you want to figure this out for yourself? We could go into the big city and find out." The boys looked at her as if she were insane. Izyk was nearly convinced she must be. "We should just turn ourselves back over to my uncle," said Izyk desperately. "Are you guys chickens or what?" asked Nova. She lunged and pulled the necklace from Mason's hand before he even noticed she was moving. "Come on!" They had no choice but to run along behind her.